Hello and welcome to another update. In this one we have breaking news. Today on the 20th of May at 3:54 p.m. local time, Wagner PMC has successfully managed to capture Bakhmut. They've captured a full city and they have now full control over the city. There is still the southwestern Dacha area, but it is not a part of the city. It is a subsidiary part of the city, so it does not count. Today, on the 20th of May, Wagner has 100% full control over the city. This means that the Russian forces managed to win the race, they have managed to hold back Ukrainian advances on the flanks, and they now have full control over the city. Now a lot of things will change, so let's go straight into those. Starting out, the situations on the flanks will most likely drastically change, as Russian forces will send reinforcements to hold the flanks to prevent any sort of a counteroffensive by the Ukrainian forces, and at the same time they need to stabilize it before the Ukrainian forces manage to push on. Meanwhile, with the full capture of the city, the Russian forces now have the ability to move westwards. Whether it be towards Ivaniivsk or Khromove, they can do both. According to the latest news by Zodiac Maps as well as Remy, the Russian forces have already started attacks against Khromove from 3 directions. From the northern side, from the northeastern side, and from the eastern side. So they're attacking from these 3 directions, trying to gain full control over Khromove as well. And at the same time, with the full capture of Bakhmut, the Russian forces will most likely push westwards in the direction of Ivaniivsk. So, in total, we see that the Russian forces have 2 plans and 2 operations. The first one is to push westwards out of Bakhmut towards Jazov Yar, and the second one is to stabilize the flanks and possibly counterattack in these directions. They now have the ability to spread out their forces because they have managed to gain full control over Bakhmut. Now, there has been the discussion, will Wagner pull out of Bakhmut? Will they reorganize? Will they do all of these things? There is no evidence that they will do so. Actually, evidence points in the opposite direction. Evidence points towards Wagner continuing westwards in the direction of Ivaniivsk and Jazov Yar, as well as Russian forces coming in as reinforcements throughout the whole front line. So we will most likely see continuous attacks by the Russian forces in this part of the front line, and they will most likely try to prevent any Ukrainian counterattacks to be successful in this area. So this will be a very intense time, because with the fall of Bakhmut, the Ukrainian forces will now look to do some sort of victory so that they can counteract this major victory by the Russian forces. Now they've captured Bakhmut after 9 months of fighting. So the current situation will be determined by how much forces both sides have available after this 9 months long meat grinder. With a lot of forces being lost on both sides, it has severely drained both sides' forces. So whoever has the most in reserve will be able to gain the best out of this situation. Because with the end of Battle of Bakhmut, we now have a lot of open fields to the west. We have the Ivaniivsk area north of it, in between Ivaniivsk and Khromove, is open fields. And all the way northwards, all the way up to the canal, is all open fields. There's a bit of elevation differences here and there, but mostly it's just open fields where both sides keep fighting. At the same time, in the Siversk area, it's the same situation. There's a lot of open fields. There's some hills here and there, but it's mostly just open fields. And with Bakhmut falling, there's few industrial zones in between Bakhmut and the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, which means that the Russian forces may look to push all the way up to this position between Toretsk and Sloviansk, where the Ukrainian forces will try to prevent any such push, and at the same time trying to counterattack and recapture Bakhmut. So we have 2 sides of the same coin right here, but everything points towards heavy fighting appearing in this whole area in the next coming days and weeks. So what will actually happen? We have to take a look at different things. First of all, the available forces on both sides, and then second of all, what the terrain says. So starting out, looking at the forces available to both sides, we start out with a look on the Russian side. So this is limited information, it's not very accurate, but these are the ones that have been spotted in this area. We have the 3rd Motorized Brigade, we have the 72nd Motorized Brigade, and we have the 106th Air Assault Division. Then we have 3 Wagner groups, And then we have the 6th Cossack Motorized Regiment and this 137th Air Assault Regiment. So all of these forces combined would be numbering around the 30 to 50,000 troops, possibly more depending on how many Wagner soldiers are left. And at the same time, we see on the Ukrainian side, if we look at the same scope, we have the 113th Defense Brigade and a number more of brigades, totaling around 17 brigades with 4 artillery brigades. So with this, we see that the Ukrainian forces are also numbering somewhere around those 40 to 50,000 troops based on losses and so on. And most of it is centered around Homove and the rest of Bakhmut as well as Ivanivske. So most of this fighting will be happening on the western side where a lot of forces are combined. But at the same time, we see that the Ukrainian forces are mainly focused around Homove and Ivanivske, and this area is mostly open fields with no gathering for these troops, which means that they are most likely spread out and only parts of their organizations are at the front at the same time, while others are probably spread around in between this whole area, specifically around the roads, but also mainly at Chesev Yar and towards Ivanivske. So the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces are about equal in size. However, let's look at the forms of brigades. We have the 72nd Motorized Brigade and the 106th Air Assault Division. So motorized brigades, they mainly consist of motorized vehicles such as infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, very few tanks in comparison. Then we have the Air Assault Division, which is mainly infantry, and Wagner, mainly infantry. So the Russian forces have mainly infantry units here in Bakhmut, and it makes sense because this is a urban fight. And at the same time, we see that in the flanks, we mainly see infantry. There's not been a lot of armored vehicles, especially since we've just gone through spring and we're still in the spring season for another 11 days. So most likely what we'll see is, if the weather permits, we will see a lot more armored vehicles to this front line. And the reason for that is because they are mainly fighting around open fields now that Bakhmut has been taken, which means that they will be more reliant on armored vehicles and mechanized equipment rather than infantry. And that is when we reach this conclusion, and that is Sunday all the way to Saturday is predicted to be rain and thunder. That means that it will be very bad situation weather for any armored vehicles passing through this area. So we may actually see an operational pause similar to the situation after the capture of Lysychansk, as we see that the weather will not allow any major pushes through these areas, which may indicate that both sides will do an operational pause. Ukrainians may pull back to better operational positions. Otherwise, we'll most likely see an operational pause. And after that, we will see a summer offensive going through this area, whether it be by the Ukrainians or by the Russians. But the current situation doesn't allow for any major offensives. So the Ukrainian offensive has been delayed due to the weather, again, because they refused to do any offensives prior to that. Also, any fighting northwest of Klishchiivka, if we look at the map, we can see that it is open fields. It would be very difficult to push through these areas, which means that the Ukrainian forces will need to either hold their positions or pull back to better positions to avoid getting stuck in the mud and in the rain, as they will not be unable to capture Klishchiivka before the rain kicks in tomorrow. Unless if they do capture Klishchiivka, then they will still be isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian positions. They would have to have supply lines going through these whole areas, very long areas, a few kilometers between the Ukrainian positions and the forward position of Klishchiivka. So essentially, there would be no meaning to them pushing onwards from the current position, and they'll most likely either pull back or try to hold their positions, digging into the ground. At the same time, we see that the Russian forces may want to push westwards, try to stabilize the front line, maybe take back some of the lost territories. However, most likely this is their pullback indicates that they may want these as their backward positions. They may try to take Homove as they're fighting there right now, and then try to hold that position as a straight line here to the south. And if we look at the southern parts, as long as they hold these areas to the west of Klishchiivka, the two trench networks here to the west and to the north of Klishchiivka, then they'll be able to hold Klishchiivka, so they may just look to hold those locations. And then we will not see a lot of fighting until this summer, when the weather allows it and when the situation changes and everyone has prepared or finished their preparations for an offensive. It could also be that they completely ignore the weather and do an offensive through it anyways, but that will most likely be disastrous for whoever attacks. And that is all for this update. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.